That's how you know it. That's how you know when you see all the place inside. How you doing?
Oh, pretty dress today. I'm not sure if I can break that. Did I say
That's not. That was her description.
I'm not doing this.
So
I had somebody go up and check on her station. I don't know. I haven't heard back from her. So. Yeah. Her parents stayed in Dayton. Yeah.
Some people are probably seeing themselves, so I just do that. It's distracting.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. Let's open our Bibles together to Matthew chapter 10. We'll be picking up our study about halfway through there. And before we get started, Dave, could you lead us in an opening prayer?
Our dear Father, hallowed be your name. Father, we're thankful for this time to come together this morning and study a portion of your word. We pray, Father, that you will all dismiss the cares and thoughts of this world. Concentrate on your lesson, Father, and learn what you would have us to do and how you would have us to do that. Father, we pray that you go through this morning with us. we study your word. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, we've been talking about fear. And the reason this is a topic right here in Matthew is because Jesus is in the middle of sending out these 12 into the world to partner with him in his mission. And he knows that one of the obstacles they're going to come up against is fear, right? Because it's not always going to be smooth sailing. In fact, it's surely not going to be. There were many trials, many difficulties they were going to have to face, as we're going to see, not just by strangers, but by those closest to them as well. But even if it was just from strangers, that alone can be enough to strike fear into people. We know it's very uncomfortable to have people, of course, even just disagree with you, but beyond that, to take action against you when they disagree with you. And he's been preparing them for this reality in these last, throughout this chapter, actually, in these last few studies that we've been looking at. And the topic that he's focusing on here in these, kind of in this middle section, verses 26 through 33, that Chris made it a good way through in his class, but is this idea of fear and how to deal with it, how to overcome it. And Chris talked about this idea that it's that it only makes sense to fear God more than men, and the case being made for that there in verse 28. And we looked at other passages around that in order to overcome that kind of fear that comes from what people can do to us, we need to realize that the scope of the power they have over us is very limited. It's something that's and he emphasized that by comparing it to what makes the power that men have over us, because that feels very real sometimes, and it feels very, very powerful. What does Jesus use to compare that to make us realize how small it is?
Talks about fear, and don't fear someone who can just kill your body, but fear someone who is able to take your soul.
Right. That God has ultimate power. Right. He has power over our eternity, over not just what happens here and now, but what happens for all time. And so this case is being made that what men can do to us is nothing compared to all of time, and compared to what happens after this life, after our bodies have gone away, or after our bodies have been destroyed, like he says they can do. And some of them were going to face that very thing, right? Where people were going to be physically killed for what they were preaching. And so it logically makes sense to choose wisely who you're going to fear. And one second here. And we looked at some verses that talked about the spirit that we have been given. We know that Paul was telling Timothy that in 2 Timothy 1, this is one of the last verses we were looking at in our Wednesday night class, that God has given us a spirit of, not of fear, but of what? What was that? Of respect. Okay, of power, of love, and of sound mind, right? And Chris kind of went into detail on those different things, but there's there's something beyond fear, right? There's something that's even more motivating, so he takes time in verse 28 there to kind of put fear in perspective of who we should be fearing. If we're going to fear, we should fear the one who has power over not just our physical body, but our soul, right? Our complete being. And But even more powerful than that and motivating than fear of either some kind of punishment or destruction is the boldness that we can receive by knowing God and by Him knowing us. And that's kind of the point that's made here in the rest of these verses. And that's he moves on immediately there in verse 29. So I'd like us to just go ahead and read verses 29 through 33, and then we'll discuss these things. And Gwendolyn, can you read those for us?
Are not two sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven.
All right, so he moves from talking about this idea of fearing God to and not fearing men specifically is the point that he's that's kind of being made, or what the issue that he's addressing here, to talking about sparrows and hair and how many we have of those, some more than others probably. Where does, oh, Chuck's giving me a look, I shouldn't have said that. So what is the concept that he's getting at in talking about little birds and the number of hairs that we may have? Chuck?
The smallest item on this earth is important to God. It's just as important as anything else.
Okay, it's important to him. And in order for it to be important to him, and this may just go without saying, we may not even think of it this way, but something can't be important to you if you don't know about it, right? And then that's why it's being addressed in this way. That God, it's not just saying that birds are important to God. It's saying that, what does it say? It says that one of them does not fall to the ground, what? Without him knowing it. Without him knowing it. Or some version may read, apart from your Father, which it means not that he fell to the ground with them, but that he knew it, right? It's a figure of speech talking about him knowing about it. Terry?
When he's talking about the hairs on our head, he knows us individually so very, very, very well that he can tell me how many hairs we have.
Mm-hmm.
That's how finite it is that he knows us that well.
Right. It's kind of taking things to the smallest level, right? They didn't have like the when you think about the hair, like that's the smallest piece of you. You can see like how fine and how thin it can be. Could also say he knows every cell of you, right? Or he knows every atom of you. The idea is that he knows the very details about you. And this idea of knowing someone, particularly to like the way that the Hebrews use this word know, right? This know isn't, you think back all the way back into to the beginning, right? With Adam and Eve. And when we read about them early on in creation, it says Adam knew his wife Eve, and she bore a son to him. Right? This idea of knowing, of knowledge, or of just this concept of knowing often goes much deeper than just knowledge of someone, and it's used in different ways in different contexts. But you'll notice that that term, that idea, being used from everything from the sexual relationship between a man and a woman to the actual, not just knowing about someone or the way we might get to know someone when we first meet them, right? Where we have a little bit of small talk, we ask them a few questions, and then we could say, well, we know them, right? This idea, the way that the Bible uses the word know or known is often much deeper than that. And the Adam and Eve thing is just one kind of extreme example of that, but I want us to look at some other ones as well. Carl, did you have a comment?
Said it in 1 John, 2nd chapter, verse 4 says, "He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him." So there's people say it, and people today, oh yeah, I know God.
Mm-hmm.
But according to this, to know God is to keep his commandments.
Right. Yeah, and we could see throughout Scripture this idea of us knowing God being more involved than just knowing about Him. Right. It's something deeper. It implies a relationship. Right. And that's kind of what I was getting at looking at Adam and Eve. There was a deeper relationship there, and it's talked about in that way. And same with God with us and us with God. Whenever we read about this idea of knowing, it's talking about a relationship. It's talking about something deeper than knowing of someone, that he knows that I'm alive and my name is Brian. That's not what it is, right? It's a relationship. Julie?
Well, something else I take away from it is that he knows us better than we know ourselves. Do you know how many hairs on your head? I don't know how many are mine, but he does. And with it sandwiched between the idea that we should fear God and not man, and then between him saying that talking about everyone who acknowledges me before him, the idea being he knows you better than you know yourself. You can't fool him. You may even be able to fool yourself, but God knows your heart. He knows your inner parts, and you have to keep it, that should keep us on the straight and narrow. Is what I'm trying to say. Because if we are continuing to try and do what He's telling us to do, then He'll know it.
Right. Yeah, He does. Nothing escapes his notice, right, or his knowledge. That's the point with the bird falling to the ground, right? That he knows that every detail. I appreciate it. Good point. Is there any other comments, Billy?
Yeah, if you think of that, about the numbers are hurt on our head, and I know I got less numbers than most people, but that don't matter to me, and it don't matter to him. It's just that they're numbered, and if you can think that he's that precise, just numbering the hairs on your head, think what he can do for your soul, which is so more important. He's talking about the pharaohs here, and he's talking about the value of your soul. He can take care of that too. Mm-hmm. Some people think, oh, well, God won't listen to me anyway. But God's there all the time. It's you that pull away from him.
Right. Well, and then that, I think, let's open up to Psalm 8 briefly, and I want to read this because it's this idea of knowing, right? Yes, he knows, like Julie was saying, things that we might not even know about ourselves, right? But what's the value of that knowledge, right? What does that accomplish for God in knowing that kind of detail? And what does that tell us about why he would know that kind of detail about us? Well, Psalm 8 tells us, Psalm 8 verses 3 and 4, it says, "When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" What it's telling us is that God cares for us, right? That's the solution to fear, is knowing that God cares, that he sees what we're going through, right? When these 12 and us today are going through the persecutions, the difficult times, that God is mindful of that he cares for you, that he's not going to forget when you may feel alone, when you may feel like you're struggling through this and your family has abandoned you and your friends are betraying you, that God is there and he's caring for you and he's still mindful of you. And that's the idea behind this knowing you. Chuck, and then
It should not be surprising to us that he knows all about us. He created us. He knew what then and he does now.
mhm. Yeah, right. From the very beginning, he's known us before we were even who we are right now. Chris?
That was kind of the same idea that I was thinking about, that we asked, God cares about us, but who is he? He is the one that created all things. He is the one in the verse we read, the heavens, the work everything, the stars,
Mm-hmm.
the mutable being. This is the one that can do anything at any time, in any way that he wants to. And so we're not dealing with somebody that cares for us, that is incapable or is incompetent. We don't have to fear, because the one that cares for us can do anything he wants with us. And that gives us a sense of comfort and confidence that we go out and do with it.
Right. Yeah. Especially that those things give us the strength, right? They give us, they're essential. And we'll see that when people fail to have the strength that they need, it's because they, it has to, it's tied into this idea of maybe forgetting that, right? Of forgetting that, and this all kind of ties back into knowledge in one way or another, as we, or this idea of knowing the way the Bible uses it. Did I miss another hand that was up? Okay. Let's also just a few shorter verses I want us to look at that talk about this idea and how this knowing is kind of it's a back and forth thing. Yes, God knows us, but he wants us to know him. And that's why he's revealed himself to us. And we see in John chapter 10, let's read verses 14 and 27. And Chuck, can you read that for us?
I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and know by my own. They say 27.
Mm-hmm.
My sheep hear my voice, and I know them. They follow me.
Okay, so we see this. It's kind of a reciprocal thing that we see going on here. That he knows his own. He knows about them. He knows who they are. And his sheep, it says, and my own know me, right? That there's this relationship that's happening, that they hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me, right? So part of knowing God is following him, right? That's kind of implied in this idea of knowing. And what happens when we choose to betray that, when we choose not to follow, right? There's kind of a breakdown in that relationship. There's, and we see that happening. And it's this idea of, we see it very specifically in things like denial, right? That's what our main passage ends up getting to in just a verse or two, right? That he's warning them against denying him before men, right? And that's because that's the ultimate place where this will lead to if that relationship breaks down. And we see that very, very clearly in Matthew 26. And I'd like us to go ahead and read a few verses from here now, just to just look at the language that's being used here and think about how it relates back to what we're studying. But Matthew 26, let's look at verses 69 through 75. And Julie, can you read that for us?
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You are also were with Jesus in Galilee." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you mean." And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, I do not know the man. And after a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, certainly you are one of them, for your accent betrays you. Then he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, I do not know the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly.
All right, we see that language being used there by him, where he says, I do not know. Right? And this idea of he wasn't acknowledging the relationship that he had with Jesus. Right? And that's what we see. So in our main text in verse 31, I believe the version that was read earlier said, so everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess before my Father in heaven. Now, some versions read, whoever acknowledges me, kind of tying it into that idea of knowing, acknowledging. But confession is the same thing, right? What is confession? An affirmation of what?
Knowledge.
Okay, of something that you know to be true, right? When you confess something, you're making this verbal proclamation of something that you know. And that's exactly what Peter wasn't doing here in this in Matthew 26, where we read, where he was denying them by verbally speaking against what he knew, by saying that he doesn't know what they mean. And just like we read back in a few chapters ago in our Matthew study, in Matthew 7, where Jesus is warning that on that day many will say to me, in verse 22, Matthew 7:22, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And he will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. So we see that Jesus acknowledging that relationship didn't exist, that knowing was not fully reciprocated, that it wasn't, it had never gotten to the point, and it wasn't to the point where it needed to be, even though they may have been doing certain things, doing certain deeds, because they didn't have that relationship with him, because they didn't have that same care and concern for the things of Jesus as God does for us, right? Because they didn't show that allegiance and that I'm just drawing a blank on the word that I was thinking of, but that relationship wasn't complete, and that's what Jesus is warning them against here is falling into that same kind of trap, because it's going to be very tempting when we look at what comes next in this preparation that he's giving them for going out. So does anybody else have any other comments here on the verse through verse 33? All right, so let's go ahead and look at verses 34 through 39. Uh, 34 through 39. And Josh, can you read that for us?
You don't think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother. A man's enemies will be from those around him, and those who so gossip. He who loves his father or mother more than me will not worthy of me. And he does son or daughter of what he is not worthy of me.
Could you go through verse 39?
And he who does not take his cross so much of me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life to lose it, he loses his life for my sake.
Okay, so when I read this passage, it's a sad thing to read, right? It's a to put yourself in this position, especially when you come from a family who has strengthened your faith, right? When you're part of a community where there's people who are aligned with you, who are working together with you, to think about the kind of extreme situation that this is describing here. And I know there's parallels we can make to this with things that we often have to go through. And some people don't have, many of us, even here this morning, our relationship with Christ has affected our relationship with our families. And it's a very sad thing when you think about that how family can be used and is often used, specifically in what he's warning them about here, as kind of a weapon to divide allegiances, a weapon to pressure those who are faithful to deny Christ. There in verse, looking like considering that this is coming right after what we read about in verse 33, which said, "Whoever denies me before men, I will also deny before my Father in heaven." And then he rolls right into this section, talking about how family and those closest to you are going to rise up against you, and to kind of putting these two sections together and looking at this flow of thought, that this is going to be what really gets to some people, right? This is going to be what can bring many people down, right? Is this kind of conflict that can exist. And so it's only natural that we would want to avoid this at all costs, right? That we would want to not get into this kind of situation where those closest to us are against us. Right? That's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to confront face to face. And so there's two ways that we often try to do this, or there's two ways that we might bring peace to a situation, right? Which is what we desire. We desire to have peace. And one of them is the very thing that he's been warning about. That we might try to give in to those who oppose the choices and who oppose our faith, and in doing so, denying Christ in the process. Right? That's exactly the trap that Peter fell into. He didn't want to be in that particular moment. He didn't want to be called out. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. He didn't want that focus on him as being with Christ, and so he denied him, and that was a moment of weakness that he experienced. And we're all vulnerable to the same kind of thing. And so one way is to give into that, like we read the example of Peter doing. The other is to accept peace, but on the peace that God extends to us. And we do that by acknowledging Christ as our Lord, by confessing that. But oftentimes, this doesn't bring peace to us on this earth, right? Which is the very point that he makes there in verse 34, right? Jesus wants to be very clear that the kind of peace that's available through him, and it's often not going to be the peace that comes on this earth. He says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword." And we know this is only talking about in one sense, because in some senses, as we're going to see, Jesus' very purpose in coming to earth was to bring peace. But as often the case, it's easy to misunderstand the nature of the peace, or just like it was easy to misunderstand the nature of his kingdom. Right? A lot of people wanted to, thought about it in that it was a kingdom of this world, that it was going to be one with swords. Same thing. The kind of peace that he's bringing isn't the kind of peace that we may try to make that will bring peace to the whole earth, in the sense that we in the world often talks about that kind of peace. Gwendolyn?
Well, going back to where you talk about like loving family more than God, or where Jesus is telling them. And then where I was looking at Genesis 22, where the story of Abraham and how he was going to take Isaac and give up his own son that he had wanted so bad. He was ready because God had told him he was ready to do this because he loved God and he was with God. So it comes down to that kind of thing where for me it's like family may want me to come over and sit up and drink and get high or whatever with them, but if I love God more than that, then I have to follow what He's telling me to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah. Well, and also realize that there's a greater peace that you're pursuing, right? Which is peace with God, and to be ultimately to help other people have peace with God too.
But what I'm saying is that they may not want to be around me, like me, because I won't come and do those things. But
yeah,
gotta take that chance.
Yeah, well, that could be difficult sometimes, but yeah. John.
Just gonna read that. I was gonna ask, like, what do you think that, we know that Jesus came to expose these ways that people shake things up, to change things, to challenge what everybody else thought, to bring more reality to God, to these people, to split them. Like, that's just all I see. It's just, that's why he would say, think not that I come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace but a sword. I am come to set man at variance against his father and daughter against your mother. The moment that you change what we all thought we knew as a whole, of course we're all going to turn against people like, oh, you're with that person, not changing things. And I feel that that's exactly what it says. Intentionally to shake things up to make you change how you move or live your life.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it could be. It's the same in some ways and different in some ways. When you have, like, there may be, family situations where, like, they don't like what you're doing because it's not doing something that they're, that they enjoy or something. But other times, like this case here, these were deeply religious families, right? Who had they were very devoted to God, at least in up until a certain point, until they rejected the Messiah who came. But they were, you could see how this would be could have such a strong reaction to these people who are accepting Christ and confessing Him and His teachings and the significance of what that meant, that the family might feel like it was kind of undermining their whole faith, and driving them to do things that are even beyond the consequences of somebody who may just be offended at the things you won't do. It's almost like this whole layer on top of that is going to be different in some ways than that. But of course they share the same thing, that it can be difficult in both situations. There's another hand over here. No, Billy.
Yeah. Looking at Luke 12, like 51 through 53, it's talking about the same thing we're talking about, just two different languages, but it also shows just, it's in your own household, how He's going to divide it. May I read that?
Yeah, please.
suppose ye that I come to give peace on earth, I tell you nay, but rather division. For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, 2 against 3. The father shall be divided against the son against the father, the mother against the daughter against the mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. So, he's talking about household over there.
Mm-hmm.
He means right in your own family.
Yeah.
You're gonna have some that's gonna raise questions of what you're trying to say or make them believe or whatever. There's gonna be dissension there. He's gonna have to cause division, and what one of your jobs is trying to preach about the division so you can bring peace within your own family.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. It's Richard.
The way I look at it is also it's a personal conflict within yourself to kind of don't want to go against your family, but you have to. And that will drive you to dig deeper into the truth so you can show examples of what he's wanting you to know. So it makes you also strive to dig deeper in what he is wanting. And then you can, once you learn it, then you can logically and knowledgeably teach others, exactly what it's saying and bring them to him, a lot more clearer, So me personally, I think it would be easy to dig deeper, because my family is Catholic, and I pulled away once I started studying here. And all that did was make me go to my brothers and my parents and try to show them what I've learned that's a lot different than the Catholic religion. And, I'm still uphill battling that, but, I have gotten through to some that actually are listening, video wise as well. So it's a struggle, but it's a conflict that's given me strength to push forward.
Yeah. Well, right. And that's the thing though. You didn't let it, just because there was a division there, that didn't hold you back from making the choices you needed to make. Right. And I think that's the point in this preparation and sending them out, is to help them know that, look, some of your family isn't going to make the same choice that you're making. And that doesn't mean that your choice is the wrong one, because those closest to us, it can feel wrong when you go against them, right? In some ways, especially when you might be younger, that's especially true. And so I think that's right. I think that's a good example of course, we want to be patient in teaching them as well, but we also need to make the decisions. Like Christ came on this earth. It says he brought a sword. He calls everyone, he set a choice before everyone, right? All of us have this choice that's set before us. And when different people make different choices, that's going to cause division, right? That's going to cause these kind of conflicts. Last comment, Barry, and then I think classes will be over after this.
You're talking about the death of 42, 33. Stuff like this, get into this.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to take commitment to do this. We're going to have, even though they may not understand somewhere else, we want to do this on Sunday. You go every Sunday, you do this once. You go twice on Sunday anyway. It's one of those. If they don't understand, you're going to have to tell them you got to get commitment. Tell them no. Services, that's what's first. They may not understand. There's going to be good push. It's going to take commitment to get through this. If everyone around you understand.
Right. Yeah. You don't want others to change what you know to be or just acting on your own convictions. Right. That's important. So appreciate Jeff holding out on that last bill there for a minute. And I encourage us all also to just look back, think back through the stories that we know in the Bible of this kind of conflict coming up for these same reasons, right? You have stories like Cain and Abel, like Joseph and his brothers, like David like David writes Psalms about these conflicts between those who are closest to him. If you want to read Psalm 55, I encourage you to do that before our next class, Psalm 55. Appreciate everyone's comments today.
Well, thank you, Brian.
You look like now he's well, right now, I'm not online. So what I do is online and I can pull it
My granddaughter is like Irish. I just don't feel like that.
Okay, she gets stuff. Oh, Scott gets oh, okay.